Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our ReggieCon panel discussing artificial in celebration of Women's History Month. This is our second ReggieCon panel for the spring semester with a few more to come, so get excited about those. My name is Jana Albrecht. I'm the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management here at Illinois State University. Before we start the panel, I actually have just a few details to keep everything running smoothly to help our panelists out as well. So first, we do record the session and it will get posted to the ReggieCon website. Second, if you need confirmation of attendance that you participated tonight, we will post that link towards the end, either in the Q&A feature or in the chat section. So you can go ahead and complete that towards the end of the panel. Third, the presenters' video and audio are on, but they can't hear or see any of you as a guest. That said, they really appreciate that you're here and your participation, and we do monitor that Q&A function, and they do love to answer your questions. So go ahead and throw those questions in when you have them. Just know that we might not get to your question right away, but we will get to that question eventually. And last but not least, it's just more of a reminder to check our ReggieCon website for some of our previous panels. They're fantastic. But also to stay in the know for future panels and future events. So enough of the housekeeping from me. At this time, I am thrilled to introduce our fearless leader, Dr. Scott Jordan. Dr. Jordan is the chair of psychology here at Illinois State. He also happens to be our moderator and a pretty cool dude. So Scott, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jana, and welcome everyone to ReggieCon, the con that asks the question, what's your story? I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist, philosopher here at Illinois State University. And tonight we come together to celebrate Women's History Month with a discussion of author Amy Kurzweil's amazing graphic novel, Artificial. Joining me in tonight's discussion is a crew of pop culture aficionados. We begin with ReggieCon alum. She celebrated Women's History Month with us in the past, the always fantastic Dr. Leandra Parris. Leandra, please tell the audience a little something about who you are and what you do.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Leandra Parris, Associate Dean of Diversity Inclusion for the School of Education at William & Mary out here in Virginia. I spend most of my time looking at socially just practices in education and using narrative therapy approaches for equity-centered, trauma-informed care with youth.
Awesome. So glad to see you again. Also joining this evening's discussion, another ReggieCon alum, the queen of cosplay herself, Dr. Shelly Clevenger. Shelly, please come on in and tell everybody who you are and a little something about what you do.
That was quite the introduction. So thank you for that.
But I have the photos to prove it, so.
I'm the chair of the Department of Victim Studies, which is the only Department of Victim Studies in the country, maybe the world. And I do love cosplay and comics, and I'm really happy to be here.
Excellent. Participating in ReggieCon for the very first time, an expert in social media communication, the one, the only Dr. Allison Nguyen. Allison, please come on in and say hi and tell everyone a little something about what you do.
Hi, I'm an assistant professor of psychology here at ISU, and I'm really interested in how we talk to each other, particularly in online contexts, with my work focusing on things like political discourse.
That's fantastic, and glad you're joining us. And now for our final panelist, literary scholar supreme, coming to us live from Shajri University in India, Dr. Gurpyari Bhatnagar. Gurpyari, please introduce yourself to the audience and tell them who you are and what you do.
Hi, I am Gurpyari Bhatnagar. I teach literary criticism in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shajri University, India. As I think I've said before, I am in love with theories, and I believe, literature and theories give us newer perspectives to look at ourselves, our life, and also the life beyond. And I'm surrounded with a bunch of kids who share the same perspective, and that adds a lot of meaning to my life.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Also in my, spare time, whenever I get some time, I write, poems and short stories. So,
well, we're so glad you're here
to
discuss this amazing piece of work. And now, one and all, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome to tonight's discussion our very special guest, cartoonist for The New Yorker, author of the graphic memoir, The Flying Couch, and author of tonight's topic of discussion, Artificial, a Love Story, the incomparable Amy Kurzweil. Amy, please say hi to the audience and tell them a little something about yourself.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm so honored and excited to hear what people think about Artificial. So my name is Amy Kurzweil. I am a San Francisco-based New Yorker cartoonist, so I've got both coasts covered. And I studied writing formally and taught myself how to draw. My first book, Flying Couch, is about my grandmother's story on my mother's side. She was a Holocaust survivor, and I documented her story along with the story of women in my family. And Artificial, this current book, turns to my paternal legacy and talks about my father, the futurist and inventor Ray Kurzweil, and this audacious project he has to create a chatbot from his father's archives. And his father was a Viennese musician who fled the Nazis in 1938 and died in 1970. I never met him. And I wrote this book about that mission and him and me and my dad and many other things, which we will discuss.
Yeah, I was actually figuring out, should I call it a graphic memoir? Should I call it a graphic novel? And when I went online, they didn't give me an indicator. So I said graphic novel. We can discuss it later. So
It's all
thanks, Amy.
good.
We're glad you're here.
You can also just call it comics if you want. That doesn't offend me.
Well said. Thank you very much. So before we get into discussing Artificial, there's a few people we have to thank. First of all, we have Dr. Janet Albrecht, whom we've already met, manages enrollment management and student success for the university and strongly supports ReggieCon. We've got Mr. Sean Thornton, who does all the beautiful artwork for ReggieCon. If you've seen a few of these things over the years, you know. We're going to put a book together someday and sell it as a collection because it's quite good. Danny Schroeder, she's runs university management, marketing and communications, and she's very helpful with getting the word out about ReggieCon. Miss Summer Simmons is the person who makes sure that the Zoom room is clean and that we take care of it while we're here and that we all know how to get here and all know how to leave. Miss Kelly Helmern is the lead staff in psychology and she makes sure that all the right funds get to the right people. And Ms. Julie Manet Perez actually works in university marketing communications, and she's been posting 30-second reels, advertising ReggieCon panels, which is a new thing for us. So we're very excited about all that. So I'm going to try this because it has to do with why Julie's helping us market ReggieCon right now. So I'll go to this next. Hold on. Now I'm going to try this. Anybody tell me quickly if you hear music, because I tried to hit with sound. Do you hear music? All right. I tried it twice. I'm going to stop. I apologize for that. But the reason I did that is because I went to a digital music class in the fall. And I told them we do these ReggieCon things, and I put a little 30-second intro tune, outro tune at the front and back. And I asked the students if they would be interested in writing digital jingles for these ReggieCon videos, and they did, and they rocked. And so what I do now is I put them under the 30-second intro video. She posts them on Instagram. These young people their names getting out there between 4,000 and 10,000 times a post. So it's a really cool thing for the students, and it's also what ReggieCon is all about, which is getting generations of university folks, faculty, students, staff, all into the world of creativity and expression. So I can't share that with you, but this year's students' soundtrack was Rosalie Trubach. And if you go to Instagram, you'll be able to see the post, and you'll have it with sound. Finally, let me see, I got to go to the next one. There you go. Finally, I have to let everyone know about an amazing event happening on campus at the end of April. It's called ReggieCon Live. It's a 4-day celebration of creativity at Illinois State University. That QR code there, which you can see is also on my backdrop, will take you to the webpage for ReggieCon Live 24. Let me just give you a sample of what's going to be there. So Saturday is devoted to student creativity. So we have a series of what are called student showcases. So we have ReggieCon Digital Music Showcase, Creative Technologies Game Design Showcase. Amy's going to be there doing a comics workshop, if I could say. You gave me permission to say it that way, comic creation workshop. The Department of English has got 5 groups of students doing panels on all the things you see there: New Worlds, Flash Fiction Generator, Ruins and Archives, etc. And then there's another showcase called Creative Approaches to Nature. And some of my students will do something on a class we teach, and people from the Horticulture Center will be there. And then on Sunday, we're having a full day workshop conference at the Ruins of Contemporary Culture. What will tomorrow's minds say about today's selves? That's open to the public. We're hoping to be able to broadcast it on Zoom, which of course would be free. If you want to go in person, it's important that you register to make sure you save a slot. And the final day, I've asked all these great people who are going to be here on Sunday to do workshops and such across campus. Some of them are in classes and kind of private, but many of them, as you can see, are open to the public. And we'll have some of those going on Tuesday as well. So I just wanted to make sure I shared that all with you. And now what I want to do is get into the business of celebrating Women's History Month. So I've asked all the panelists to read the graphic novel and pick their favorite frame, page, whatever it is they wanted to pick, share it with us. Each of them is going to take their time in explaining why that page mattered to them. 2 or 3 minutes, uninterrupted is the rule. And then once they get their vibe out, then the rest of us will spontaneously discuss what we just heard. The point here is to have an adult, sophisticated, nuanced after dinner conversation about the work, making sure that everybody has time to be centered. So I'm going to start with our first, and I believe this was, whose was it? Leandra's?
No, it's mine.
Yeah. All right. So Shelly, please, the floor is yours.
Sure. So it was hard to pick just one frame, but this is the one I picked because whenever I think of losing someone, I think about that sort of inevitable packing up their items and putting things away and picking things that you keep. But that I also think of this kind of figuratively. So I'll use my aunt as an example. So when my Aunt Jackie died, we had to clean out her house. And so, we couldn't take everything, but the things that we took also had some sort of story behind them. So we have the physical object, like I have her engagement ring, and then I have the story with the engagement ring, and I have her decorations for the holidays. And so each year when we put out the decorations, I tell the story of how she would put out these different things every year. So when I think about this, and I liked this panel, when people die, it's often really hard for us, but they do kind of become these stories, oftentimes related to objects, which I think, is a great way to honor someone, because oftentimes, we think about the big moments, but like the engagement ring, but it's also the small moments. Like we have her Easter village out. So it's something that isn't necessarily the biggest thing of the year, but it's something we look forward to. So I thought that this was just beautiful, and I'll be completely candid and say that I kind of teared up when I read it, because it is on what we decide to keep. And those things kind of remind us of those people. And for me, like I think about, like I said, my aunt being with me all the time because of her engagement ring, but then at these other kind of moments, I have them, and my daughter now has them.
Absolutely. Who would like to follow up on Shelly's comments about that page? Okay, I'll start. I'll get the ball rolling. This phrase, it depends on what we choose to keep. So I'm an experimental psychologist by trade, perception, action stuff. And I can think of nothing more difficult to do than throw away something from someone who's passed. And those very conscious moments of salience and lost have got to be one of the hardest. I also have to mention that people in my life who've passed, I've kept things like sandals for the very reason, very reason that Shelly said, right? Because the sandals remind you of things and they're kind of personal, right? There's just something else to add to this idea of consciously choosing what to keep. The way we do things, we're constantly doing things every moment we call paying attention. And that means we're focusing on this thing. And the data are pretty clear. In order to be able to pay attention to anything, your brain has to inhibit the influence of everything else. So we're making these choices of what to ignore constantly. You know, the phrase death by a billion cuts comes to mind because there's so many things we miss. But I'm not here to say that's bad. I'm here to say that's the human condition because we have to focus. So when I want to find my lost keys, I become a key finder. I don't know how my brain does it, but it does. And everything else that has nothing to do with keys is a little harder to get into the system. So we're constantly choosing what to keep, to be a bit poetic for the moment. A lot of that stuff is mostly unconscious, but those moments of conscious choice have just got to be the worst.
And I really liked in the story, kind of drawing off both of you, like the Coco reference, because when I read that, I was like, oh, yeah. Also a huge Disney fan, so thank you for that. And just the idea that, like, as long as people remember us, we keep going. And so I think the idea of having artificial sort of conversations based on artifacts and things like that's fascinating, given that what we hold on to when people are gone is our memories, and that evolves. The things that I choose to keep and what is salient changes based on what I need in the moment. And so that's what I found so interesting about the bot, trying to pull out these questions that you were asking. If that wasn't there in the documentation, it's not there.
Yep.
But it's there for you. And how we keep those little things and how they don't make sense to other people. And I just really hold on to that, I think, as a way of us transcending for ourselves, is leaving something behind worth keeping. And I think I'm really glad you picked that whole section, because that was my second choice. I always worry that we're going to pick the same thing. But just that idea too of like, what else can we leave behind? And should it be something that we created, or is it what our loved ones create with our memory? You know?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting whenever you're going through someone's things and what you're going to keep, because people find value in like totally different things. I have this very odd witch that was like my grandma's that people are afraid of, that people like, no one wants to even see her when they come to my house, but like I value that. And I kept that when she died. So, as long as that witch is alive, my grandma will be alive. Because I love the Coke. I love that you also put Coco in here too. I almost picked that one because I do think, yeah, as long as someone remembers you, you're still with us.
I have so much I want to respond to, but I
please
might
go ahead.
Wait for.
No. You
wait.
jump in now. Sorry about that. I should have said something.
Well, I just love what people have said so far, and I also appreciate always hearing what personal memories, what other characters from readers' lives are resonating in the gaps of my story. So I always really appreciate hearing that. So thank you for sharing about the witch and the sandals and other things. A big question of the book was trying to figure out what this artificial chatbot character is. Is it my grandfather? Is it a shadow of my grandfather? Is it something else? And I think what this passage, Shelly, that you selected highlights for me is one of the conclusions I came to about what this chatbot is. It's a co-created choice-like character. It's analogous to a work of art because of that co-creation in the choice, both from me, from my father, from history, from things outside of our control. The elements of the data set in my grandfather's chatbot are a product of some sort of artistic force that has to do with the choice of what was put into it.
Yeah.
And that's part of why I came to see it as a work of art, and a work of art that's reflecting my grandfather's identity. And coming to the conclusion that it's a work of art is not a way to diminish its importance. In a way, it was actually a way for me to sort of elevate this thing, that it's not a gimmick. It's something more. It's not a gimmick, and it's also not a conscious entity. It's something more in the middle, which is in this art space. And I think that choice element, what we choose to keep, is the key there.
Yeah, and I just wanted to actually jump in on that point too. We have this idea in like conversation literature where we're always creating stories about ourselves and our culture and who we are, and like that's actually why we tell stories to each other. And when I came to this panel, actually this is one of the panels I was considering as well, because it really spoke to that sort of idea of like, you know, what is a memory of the people that we love, if not these stories that we tell ourselves and we tell to our children and that they've told us through their items and things like that. And so all of these choices are like these sorts of stories. And I think that's art. I mean, I think it was like, I think I independently came to this conclusion that like, of course this chatbot is art. Like there's no other thing it could be, because of this like idea that like we're doing this all the time with all these different stories, and this is just another way of kind of constructing a story.
Yeah, I really like the reference to it as art, in the sense that all the choice spaces you mentioned show up in any piece of art, and artists are simply constrained by technology in terms of what they can do. And with the unleashing of digital technology, now you have an unbelievably robust piece of interactive art, right? And when Leandra was talking about when she would ask about her grandfather's, how he escaped from Vienna, or how, you know, and he would give these very didn't give you answers you want because it wasn't there. It kind of reminds me of opening the top drawer of my dresser with all my junk. You know, if someone opened that, they wouldn't have an explanation of what all that is. It's like, okay, that he didn't write about that, did he? Leave that there. So I like that idea that, you know, the choosing is the point. Yeah.
Right. And the further away you get from knowing the original source material, the more imagination is required to interpret all those bits and bops in your drawer. I could have a field day not knowing you very well, figuring out what those items mean. And that would be a fun creative exercise, but I would have to understand that I'm bringing a lot to that interpretive exercise.
You know, I can actually see families buying these things to use during holidays, in the sense that a loved one would be there and they would all talk, and it wouldn't be something desperate or sad. It would just feel fun and enriching, and everybody would know what it is, right? And all the things we've talked about, but it would just be, for example, I have a recording on my phone of when our family all did DNA tests. And I recorded it because my daughters and my wife and I are like very different in terms of our genetic background. Both my girls are adopted, and the stories that they all created, particularly finding out that I was 0.7% Somali, and telling them, well, I told you I'm from Africa. And they say, no, Dad, you're from Mississippi. My kids were smart enough to tell that story at that time. And that's now family lore. So if I brought that out now and interacted with it, it would just be a recursion on that same sort of idea. So I think you're right. These are going to show up in everybody's life for sure. Anybody else? Comments on that frame? All righty then. Now we will go to Leandra's frame. Is that correct? That yours?
Yes, it is. Can I just say, making us choose one frame is like
really... Oh, I'm the worst. I'm the absolute worst. It's
so...
that choice thing, right?
So I chose this one. It is a love story according to the title, and I was like waiting at the beginning. I'm like, okay, so like, where's the love part? And then it came, in lots of different, wonderful and unexpected ways. And What I loved about this one was actually just the heartbeats, sort of showing how they're different and they look really musical. I mean, I'm a violinist and it looks very similar to notes that I would take on my own sheet music. And so when I first flipped the page, I was like, oh, it's sheet music. And then I had to take a minute and take a step back to say, oh, no, wait, that's heartbeats. So I just thought that was just like a beautiful sort of intersection across the theme for the book. And what I really loved about it is that you have two different heartbeats and they make a rhythm, they make their own song, their own beat. And we always talk about like our hearts beat as one. And I never like loved that because it made it seem like we had to change to be exactly the same. We had to follow the same beat. We had to acclimate. And this drawing really kind of shows, no, we are who we are. We meet each other where we are, and it's this beautiful thing. And there's reasons for why we are. So you're a little bit anxious, or it's the medication. And I know there's a lot that goes through that in terms of health and stuff. And so I kept trying to find like, I don't know how to explain it. Something about it just really grabbed onto me. And I think some of it is that before this, you see the word soul pop up a lot. And this is kind of how I see that, as these two rhythms coming together. And then seeing it again later, when you're joined up during the pandemic and kind of hearing that little love song that's just for the two of you, I just found that to be really beautiful and to be something that you can only have in the moment and can only enjoy in the moment. Yeah, I'll stop there. I could say so much more. I genuinely, the most simplest little piece, just the most beautiful part of the whole thing for me.
Anyone else? And I can put the image back up if you'd like. Just tell me and I will.
I have a question for the author, if I'm allowed to. I'm going to respond to Leandra. But what was the medication used for?
The beta blocker.
Oh, okay. I was like,
the heartbeat. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I had to look that up.
Okay, I was just looking at it and I was like, I didn't know what that was. I liked this one a lot too. I saw it similarly, but also differently because I thought of like how different two people can be, but they still fit. And that, having the heartbeats being different, but yet those people still come together because, if you've been in a relationship, some of the things that might frustrate you about your partner also are like good for you. And so I was thinking about like the different kinds of heartbeats can also be, thinking about what could be different about those people, but yet they come together so beautifully. And I liked this frame a lot too.
Anyone else? Well, I liked the use of the heartbeats, and Leandra mentioned it looked like notes. None of us listened to, very few of us ever listened to single note songs with just one instrument playing. We listened to music with chords, and that's the mastering of bringing together multiple frequencies and multiple amplitudes and making them work. And, music was such a robust aspect of the entire story that you see a frame like this and you kind of get this poetic juxtaposition of the grandfather's music and the love here. And I think that's part of what juxtaposition, but also maybe a little tension, because it's not music, but is it? And then suddenly I'm questioning what I mean by music. Suddenly I'm questioning what I mean by love. And that's the point of good art, right? It's, you break it up a little bit. And now I got to think and go back. And so I thought that was a masterful image. Anyone else? All right, then. And if you go ahead, please do.
I have things to say. I just want to.
Oh, no, just jump in. Don't worry about it. Just
thank you, Leandra, for choosing that image. My partner, Jacob, who's obviously a big part of the story, often teases me because I don't get him into my pitch for the book. It's like, because there's a lot else going on with my father and my grandfather and AI and history. But the through line of the book is what's happening in my life as I'm encountering all these themes, and why are they relevant? They're relevant because I'm trying to figure out how to be a person who loves another person, and all the anxiety and fragility of that experience of being alive. So thank you for choosing a Jacob scene. And the thing I want to say that I love that you noticed is the idea of the heartbeat as music, there's a motif I'm working with formally in the book, which are these strips, which I don't know if you noticed that there's lots of strips in the book. There's hands on keyboards, moment by moment strips. There's just moment to moment of anything that's happening in a scene. There'll be these strips across without any white space between them. And that's meant to give you this fluid sense of time bleeding together musically, I guess, is my way of thinking about that. And the heartbeats as music is resonating with the idea that I'm sort of trying to think of everything as one bar of music, as if the whole book is supposed to be sort of analogous to an orchestra or an orchestra composition, that there are all these strips, and then what is that sheet music for? It's for the reader to create their own symphony. You know, each symphony is going to be somewhat unique because the reader's going to bring that to life in their own way. And then there's some analogy there to AI and the idea of code, and then what the code becomes, and that it always needs somebody, some consciousness to bring it to life. So every conversation that you have within a large language model requires your consciousness to make meaning of it. So that's a lot, but just your observation that the heartbeat is like music notes makes me think about all of that. And then your observation about two people becoming one in that heartbeat, where my super fast, anxious heartbeat is overlapped with Jacob's cool, calm, and collected heartbeat. That is resonating with me. I didn't even think about this with the Aristophanes myth that comes up in chapter 2, which is from Plato's Symposium, this story that Jacob and I talk about. He has me read the Symposium because I'm trying to learn about love and ideas about love that come from philosophy. And so one of the myths in the Symposium is Aristophanes' myth of the idea that we used to be in ancient times these big roly figures that were merged, two heads, two sets of genitals, two sets of limbs, and then we were cut. And then our quest for love is trying to get back to each other. And I don't think that is the only way to think about love, but that is one idea about love that is overplaying sort of throughout the whole book.
Awesome.
I love that.
Oh, yes. Please.
So I was just gonna say, I love that. And from now, and in Star Trek, there's like Dalek and Majah, you know what I'm talking about, Scott, the whole metaphorical language. From now on, when I think of love, like that heartbeat, that's gonna be I'm just gonna send that, because that to me is just, thank you so much. I'm glad. The whole thing was great. Sorry, go ahead. I know someone else was trying to talk.
Yeah, so yes, AB. So thank you so much. The way, I mean, you've brought a new model of narrative, altogether, because you're talking about Holocaust, which has been silenced and marginalized in the past. But then you bring in these little memories, very personal memories, and then you juxtapose this very important narrative, with these, small memories, and therefore you bring in, this new model of, storytelling, which has not really happened, especially here in India. If I, talk about, say, the partition of India and Pakistan, that had, taken place in the past, and, that has been, written about. But then, these personal narratives have not really been talked about around that. And therefore, this is a very, very new model, that I think would inspire, I think a number of authors, across the globe. And these very, very small, personal memories really count in the text. And that's the reason, you go back to these, memories, and because, they're so inspiring. They tell you so much about, love, relationship, and then, about, soul, about life. It's not just, it's just Holocaust is just in the background, but then, there is so much, else to see, in the text, and to take a look at in the text. So that's a very new model then that you've brought on the table. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, since you're saying that, I just want to acknowledge my influences in comics. So when I first read Mouse, probably you've heard of Mouse and read Mouse, story, it's a Holocaust story. A lot of the book is about Art Spiegelman's father's Holocaust story. But the moments that I liked the most in that book, as someone who comes from a Holocaust inherited history, the moments I liked the most were the present day moments where he was just interacting with his father, because I recognized so much of my own experience in the way that he spoke with his father and the family dynamic. And it was not all positive. There was a lot of stress, and you could understand the present and the past and how everything was fitting together. So I'm really influenced by that way of telling stories about history. And I think, especially when it comes to the Holocaust, I think it's important to tell stories about that history with an eye towards moving away from it, not to forget it, but to make sense of it and bring us into a different condition. I mean, I know someone here has said victim studies, Shelly, right? I mean, I'm so interested to hear more about your work, because I think it's so relevant to the things I think about as a memoirist, writing about the Holocaust and how to conceptualize that identity of being victimized, but also wanting to move towards a different way of thinking about that identity.
Yeah, and this is where, history is different from literature, as if you go back to, poetics, for instance, Aristotle's Poetics, when he said, history is the imitation of, action as it is, while, literature, he said poetry is the imitation of an action as it should be. So, look at the difference, that we have there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and anyway, Allison, did you want to say something? I look like you wanted to say something.
No, but I thought Shelly was maybe about to jump in.
Oh, I'm
so I just
sorry.
wanted to
I saw some
cede the
motion on
floor.
my screen.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, it was. I had muted because my dog was snoring. Yeah, one of the things that you were talking about, Amy, that we talk about in victim studies is this generational trauma, and how do people from all different kinds of backgrounds deal with that? Because it shows up in so many ways that can be positive and negative. And when I was reading this, I actually thought about that. And I was like, this could be something to think about with victim studies, is this idea of how people process trauma through different generations.
Yeah, I appreciate that you
Go ahead.
acknowledge that there's positive and negative with generational trauma, because you inherit a kind of resilience that you look to and make some meaning from.
Yes, and empathy for other people.
And because the past is always with us, it's always there, and it's not like anybody's telling you, you have to know this, but you just know it through their lived lives and what happens during family get-togethers. And, I appreciate Gurpyari's point. One of the narrative advantages that graphic memoir provides is this multimedia format, which some documents look like they're quote unquote official, and then some documents look like they're cartoons. And while on the one hand that's jarring, that was absolutely Sabalt's point, was to write things that jar you. So is this a travel log? Is this a story? What is this? And that constant disruption is the point of the art, to get you to question, what is a story? What is a travelogue? And I actually, I'll just say it. I think I teach a class called Otherland, where we use graphic novels to actually teach people to understand othering at every level. Because in a good piece of art, everything's relational. And in order to have A and B be relational, they have to other each other to some extent. A has to be B, A has to be A, and they have to be related. So there still has to be a B-ness there. So their teachings, and a good piece of visual art, you look at it, and every point in the art is getting its meaning in relation to the rest of the art, teaching them that in perception, and then the text bubbles. And once they capture that and can practice that, then they can, and of course, all these graphic novels have, they're all cultural aware graphic novels, if you like. They usually involve some kind of generational trauma. Then we can scale up from the perceptual to the cognitive to the social to the cultural. but just to show them how these things permeate their daily life is kind of the task. And I think graphic novels and the multimedia nature they present really provide pedagogical tools to encounter these ideas that keep them alive and not flat and not abstract. So I found this novel to be very much in that ilk. Anyone else on this heartbeat page? All right, then we'll go on to Allison's. Let me share it with you.
Well, while that's sharing, I'm just going to start by saying that, I think it's great that we started talking about generational trauma because I think my panel kind of speaks to some of the things that I was experiencing while I was reading this novel. I started reading this novel around Lunar New Year. I'm Vietnamese, and that's a time that we think about our ancestors and who we are and, you know, what it means to like be an ancestor, but also what it means to be a descendant. And so like, to me, this panel like really spoke out because I've been doing a lot of thinking about like what my family story is and what does it mean to have this family story and who were my ancestors. And, you know, I never got to meet my grandparents on my Vietnamese side and all of these things, but they did things like escape a country. They raised children in another country. They did all of these things. And to me, this panel just really kind of spoke to that. Like, I always think about that. Like, I carry that very deeply in me. It's something that's part of who I am. And like, it has shaped my worldview. And it talks like it's part of like my understanding of what it means to be a good ancestor to my descendants and what it means to be a good descendant, just sort of honoring that sort of story that they went through. And to me, this panel like really captured all of that. Like, it just really felt like all of those emotions that I was experiencing and kind of all the things that I had been thinking about in like one panel. And just thinking about, you know, our ancestors have these ambitions for us and these hopes and dreams for their children. And we have these hopes and dreams for our descendants too. And they did sacrifice and they escaped things. And like, that's part of our story. And I think it's quite beautiful. So, I mean, this like whole book was very moving for me. It, like really, I read it around the time that like I was, you know, really reflecting on all of this because it was the time of the year. And so, yeah, that's like why I picked this panel. I mean, I had so many bookmarked panels, I could have picked anything. But this is the one that I felt really spoke to me the most, especially around the time of year that I was reading this book.
Can I respond while we're looking?
Of course, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Allison, for picking a page like this because, well, what do you want to put it back? So
yeah, sure.
People's attention.
No problem.
In the page. So,
are you seeing it?
No, we're seeing your desktop.
Oh God, thank God it's clean. Oh, God. All right, hold on. Let me shift that.
Okay, while we wait for that, also, Allison, I'm curious if you've ever read Vietnamerica or The Best We Could Do. Those are two graphic. Have you read them?
I've read both of them, I think.
Okay. Really excellent graphic memoirs about Vietnamese experience of ancestral trauma and sort of moving on from those experiences.
Yeah.
So a page like this, the density of this page, when I look at it, I feel really overwhelmed because I'm remembering how much work it was to draw. But I think this is to the point about putting history in conversation with everyday experience. Here I'm recreating this newspaper article that was written by my aunt about her parents, published in a local paper. And I somewhat painstakingly recreated all the photographs that were printed in that article and edited the text a bit so that it was legible, but I included basically word for word the text from that article. And then meanwhile, I'm just like drinking coffee in the morning. And then I'm in my father's apartment where there's so many artifacts around me. There's a photo of my grandmother and my brother. There's a photo of my father when he was 17 years old. There's a bunch of books. There's a bunch of cat figurines. There's a painting in the back wall, which is this recreated Van Gogh painting that my father treasures because it's got 3D paint strokes. So there's just all this stuff. constantly in my lived experience that is calling out to the past, and that is sometimes explicitly telling the story of the past, but other times doing it in that implicit way that involves a lot of imagination that we've been discussing. And my experience of writing this book was often being really overwhelmed by the infinity of history and the infinity of my family's history. Not infinity. My philosopher partner would get mad at me for using the word infinity because it's not technically infinity, but it feels like infinity to me.
Yeah.
All the details. And then, God, I appreciate what you said about attention, because a lot of the book is ultimately about attention and what we choose to focus on, and attention as a kind of loving act. And a page like this just puts me really deeply in the perspective of my past self, of facing this enormous archive and having to make a lot of choices about what I wanted to highlight. And some pages I put so much on there that I exhausted myself. But it's okay. It's in the past.
Anyone else?
I mean, I was just going to say that I also really liked, the fact that you're just drinking coffee. Like, this is part of your day-to-day life. Like, you're going about your day, and that's like interwoven with like this story. And I mean, like, as I was reading this, I was thinking, like, if I could have a chat bot of like some of my relatives who I never got to meet, like, would I do it? Like, would it be them? Like, would it be satisfying? And I never like kind of grappled with that sort of like AI question before. So I thought that was like a very interesting thing to think about, like during this like time of reflection.
Yeah, probably depends on how the chatbot was built and what kinds of documentation you have, right?
And I mean, that's the question about like large language models in general, is like, I mean, interpretation is only as good as like whatever they're given.
Yeah, again, I just love the way you've got multiple time scales in the same space. And I'm going to put it back up because there is something about scale going on here. So the further back, if I'm not mistaken, it looks like the further back in the past, the finer the spatial scale. In other words, fine detail for past stuff, and then less detail for stuff that's closer to the present. That I'm just going to call it a juxtaposition, creates attention. And then I'm looking at all that text and it's like, do I want to read all of that? I'm sorry, do I want to sit and read that whole newspaper?
You don't have
to. But I suspect that feeling is not unlike something you may have gone through, figuring out what to include and what not to include. Do I really got to read those 3 papers to figure out if I want to include a paragraph? Because the creative process is taxing as hell, and you got to be efficient with your time. So, did you have any moments like that where you said, "No, not this"? And you don't have to say yes. We can just move on.
I mean, absolutely. There's always a feeling of incompleteness, and I have simultaneously a sense that the book is incomplete, and also a sense that the book is way too dense, and I put way too much in it. So I have both those feelings. But I appreciate your observation about the drawing style. The aesthetic shifts for me were coming from a particular creative choice to want to point to objects that really exist versus scenes and memories that are my construction. But that's a bit blurry because I can't recreate artifacts exactly as they exist. And also there's moments where I needed to make changes just based on the constraints of the book. But I did want to draw people's attention to the reality of these artifacts by changing the aesthetic. And Scott McCloud, who's a writer who writes about comics, who wrote Understanding Comics, you've probably read that book. He talks about how when you use realistic styles, it makes the reader attend more to their sensory experience. And it also sort of others the thing they're looking at because they're looking at it rather than projecting themselves onto it. And so whenever I drew myself in scene and characters in my life in scene and even the spaces of my life, I wanted to use a more cartoonish style in order to have people project their own spaces and their own identities onto those characters a little bit more. But then when I drew my grandfather's passport stamped with a J from, the Nazi regime. I wanted to be very clear about the fact that this is a real document because this is a real story and we really have these objects. And then there's a third aesthetic, which is the most imagined aesthetic, which is things that I didn't directly witness, but I'm imagining. And that's in a high contrast black and white. So that has the most room for projection. And a lot of those images are actually depicting the past, but they're depicting the past that I didn't witness. And that's why they're the most sparse and the most imagined.
No, it's fantastic. Scott McCloud will be proud to hear you say this.
I did send him a book.
That's fantastic. And I loved you discussing the subtle differences in the phenomenology, the feel that one has observing the pretty professional, what's the word? The text there that looks authentic, I guess is the word. It really looks like a document. That just truly feels different. And we often don't pay attention to that feeling and the difference in that feeling, but the artist has to if they want to use that to provoke some tension. And I'll just say my favorite historian is a guy named Daniel Borston. And what he would do is give you just the facts like any other historian, but then he always gave you vignettes about the lived lives of the characters he was trying to describe. And it was infectious. It was just reading a story, then you get all these facts in a story. And that history came much more alive for me than just, reading a whole bunch of facts. Yeah. Anyone else on this page? All right, then. We will now go to Gurpyari's page.
Right.
This is it, correct?
Okay. Yeah, this is the one. Yeah. All right. So, I'll agree with the panel. There have been a number of conversations in the text, especially between, Ray and Amy, and then, between Amy and Jacob, which are extremely, thought-provoking, and, which will really make you pause and reflect. But this, frame is one of my favorites. So this, conversation, is initiated, 2 pages prior to this frame, with Amy, raising the concern, what if my commitments are in conflict? And that statement, reflects, expectations from a woman, who has to juggle, multiple roles, relating to her, personal aspirations and her career on one hand, and then, family and relationships on the other. But then I, found, Jacob's response, very, very fascinating, when he suggested that, in the process, Amy would, become one version of herself, and not another. So I felt, is he encouraging, Amy to assert her, agency here, to assert her, autonomy here? And is he actually, suggesting that, she has the power to, embody, different versions of herself? And is he really asking her to, define herself, in view of her, own values and priorities? But then, a very, powerful conversation at that. But then it does not really end here. So the beauty of the text is, that, it takes a more philosophical turn, and then it takes you, to this frame, where, Amy, I feel that, you have actually situated, the prior conversation, into this larger, construct of, shared, human values, shared existential, concerns. Where, I felt, as a reader that, your, Amy's, versions of herself, are no longer embodied in otherness at all. And, she's no longer othered, to her priorities, to her commitments. And why? Because she's being detached from the linearity of time altogether. And, as, Jacob says, that alleviates her, suffering, that liberates her. And then, this particular frame also has, your signature style of, wit and humor. When she says, oh, do I have to meditate for that? So, no, Jacob, suggests, no, read more philosophy. So I'm just in love with this, frame. Yeah.
Oh, gosh. Anyone want to follow up on that?
I mean, I gotta say that's a
Go
that's
ahead.
a heavy lift. Like when I read that, I had to read it a few times and be like, what? So my partner is not a philosopher, but his dad is a professor of philosopher, and he pretends that he's a philosopher. So this whole interaction, I was like, this sounds like dinner at my house. It's a little too, but what it made me think of is, I love the point about, like you said, that she's filling up time as opposed to time passing by. And I feel like that perspective is just such a different way of thinking about linear processing and like the way coding and algorithms and things work. That it took me a moment, and it reminded me of The Good Place, where Chidi says, life is a wave that builds and builds and then it crashes and it joins back into the ocean. So the idea isn't that it's linear, but it's more the cyclical thing that we feel and we grow and we have different phases. And I do think some of it is taking agency and saying, how do you feel time? Like, how do you fill that up, as opposed to how do you sit here and let it wash over you? So I'm really glad that you picked that. One, because it's beautiful, and two, because it went over my head so spectacularly that I felt like I had to like go back and do some work.
Thank you for doing that work. I appreciate it.
I want to follow up on Gurpyari's observation that once she can conceptualize herself as being in time differently, the different versions of herself are no longer othering each other. I'm going to do a nerd moment here, because in the philosophical work I do, I try to get us to think differently about what we are. So in science, we usually think about ourselves as being physical bodies with either a soul or physical bodies with a mind that's made up of information, and the subjective properties are in the information, blah, 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 blah. That leads to all kinds of arguments, and some of them I don't think can be resolved. But so I would argue that we can conceptualize all living systems as embodiments of context. And the reason I like that phrase is because I'm a multitude of contexts. I got to be this context here, this context here, this context here. And it is the case that when you can feel yourself that way, you actually don't compete with other versions of yourself. We're so stuck in the West we tell high school kids, they got to know who they are. They got to know who they want to be. You got to find your true self. And I find that dangerous because they got a whole world of true selves, And so I like what this frame does. It puts it in a typical, Western philosophical framework full of love and wit, and at the same time, freeing us from the othering do of ourselves, and freeing us from the belief that we have to be a true self is very powerful. I honestly tell it to every student I can find who will listen, because there's so much pressure to know who you are. And I think that's just dangerous.
Wow, this is so interesting. My mind is blown by the idea of different parts of yourself othering each other. That makes so much sense to me. I've never put it in those words before. This conversation in the book is, as you mentioned, initiated because of time anxiety, which we might see as death anxiety, right? My life is going to pass me by, and that makes me feel anxious. And so I'm not going to get into all the philosophical jargon, but there is an appendix in the book that you can read if you want to learn about A theory and B theory of time, which I'll shout out. My friend Daniel, who's a philosopher, helped me write that entry in the appendix. But if you think about yourself as a true self moving each moment through time, you fear the end. But if you think of yourself, your true self, as filling time, you don't fear the end as much. But it's also the case that your parts of yourself can't be in competition, right? So I don't have to fear aging or the loss of my intellect or skin or whatever it is that we fear if I embrace this sense of time, because my young self and my old self are just parts of each other, so they're not in competition. I hadn't quite put it in those words about the parts of the self both being in competition and sort of othering each other, not feeling integrated. So that's really interesting. And I was thinking about including this conversation also because it's the way that this bot exists in time. And then you can make the jump to AI. The creativity of AI is its freedom from linear time, and the way that an AI character can, just like a literary character, right? Because literary characters are also freed from linear time in this way. Creative characters, representations, dreams, all these virtual spaces that we create. AI characters jump through time, and the character of Fred is this multitudinous mess of details and words and impressions that I then build a relationship with in these different molded forms, but his true self is all of it, right? So he's also not in competition with other parts of himself. He just exists in the AI space with all of his complexity and multitudinous parts.
If I could just continue this conversation for a minute more, because it's absolutely fascinating. When you have this approach, when you have this idea of yourself as an embodiment of context, then you recognize the same is true for everyone else. And then you recognize that you are a part of the context in which they're becoming. And then you become part of them and they become part of you in ways that aren't difficult to understand. It's only difficult to understand when we commit ourselves, like you said, to linear time, a true self, and blah, 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 blah. You can't ever see my true self. You know, all that stuff we get caught up in, I would say, because of, as you said, linear notions of time. So I would argue this notion of embodied context lets us understand and, dare I say, feel eternity, in the sense that I do feel everything I do matters. And I think everything everyone else does matters, because we're all in the same context, constraining each other's possibilities. I'm blathering on and on now, but I just love the fact that that same thing is being addressed with different words in different media, because I do think it's an idea that'll provide a lot of space for healing. And I'll stop blathering. Okay, anyone else on this frame? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, this is like part of what I mean by like what it means to be an ancestor. It's like, how do you like, live on in other people? Like, what are the things that you pass on? And I'm a new professor. And so I think about that a lot when I think about mentoring. Like, I'm an ancestor to my graduate students, and like, how do I pass on these sorts of things? But then it's also, I realize, like, what of the things that my advisors live on in me? Like, and are they good things? Are they bad things? And I mean, like, they're both, because they're people and I'm a person. But we all exist in these sorts of like spaces where it's like the traits I have from some of my advisors, they probably have from like their advisor's advisor, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, I thought this like whole thing was like a really neat exploration of like what it means to like exist as different selves in different times, and also at the same time, and within and outside of context.
You know what you just said, Allison, when I've been in situations where I'm discussing creativity, copyright, and AI as being seen as a violation of copyright issues, et cetera. When you mentioned being what have you, I don't know, downloaded from your mentor or whatever that was, that's where our creativity comes from. It's not like we're born in a vacuum and then we just spontaneously create everything. We got to live lives. This book is all about lived lives. We got people we lived with when we were in grad school, people we lived with when we were this, there, and all that is showing up in anything coming out of me. So people get really mad when I say, well, I'm not going to say we're AIs, but what I will say is that we're algorithms. I will say that we are patterns and we're embodiments of pattern. And so, copyright is not going to be solved by traditional notions of ownership, right? We're going to have to give up on the model of the sole creator isolated in a dark room coming up with stuff out of a vacuum, and the idea that they own it. That's probably going to go away, I'd say, within 50 years. It's just going to be untraceable anymore. But yeah, I like that idea of
Mhm.
your
Yeah,
mentor.
you're really speaking my language with that
Mm,
comment about copyright. I mean, it's so complicated because we do live in the current world, so we have to accommodate that and fight the battles we need to fight in order for
yep.
people to have dignified lives and all that. But
Yes.
what I think AI does make clear is that the boundaries of the self are not as we walk through the world thinking that they are, right? That we are downloading from our ancestors, that we are embodied contexts. It's very hard sometimes to see that we're overlapping heartbeats, we're all
Yes.
these things. And so this idea of owning and the soul creative genius, which is sort of another theme in the book that we haven't talked about, that my grandfather and my father are both influenced by that narrative and have taken on that narrative of really needing to prove their individual genius. My grandfather for reasons of survival, and my father also similarly for reasons of survival. And that often when we feel the need to express this transcendent soul genius, it's because of feeling threatened. That's often, I think that is a natural response to being threatened. So the true AI utopia, which doesn't exist and probably won't exist, but the one that we can dream about is one in which we don't feel threatened and we can acknowledge the overlaps in our identities.
Yeah. I don't know if we're ever going to not feel threatened.
Right.
As a species, right? It's kind of built in. Any other comments on that frame? Okay, we got one frame left. It's about 10 after 8. So those of you who have questions out there, please send them in the chat now. I'll go to my next frame and then I'll come back to questions. So one of the things that, well, what I do in my work is talk about the neurophysiological, psychological, philosophical roots of cooperative action. And the reason I do that is one of the themes in this book is that the self comes from others. And, when you're at a bar and you're trying to explain your theory to people, it's easier to just come up with little sayings. So my saying is that the self is a byproduct of persistent interactions with others, right? It's what the choices you talk about, right? Those choices are being handled unconsciously every moment by what I look at, what I think, blah, 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 blah. All those little choices are parsing out what I keep out of my interaction with the others in the world. So I become what's left after all those things have been left. And again, thinking about the self that way renders it not just inherently social, but inherently worldly. Right. And I would argue we are naturally and necessarily about the context that we're in. So meaning isn't something we find, it's something we manage. We manage it with these little choices that we make all the time at all these different scales. And then this frame starts talking about people just want to feel known. And that just I mean, one of my colleagues, Dr. Eric Wesselman, studies ostracism, and ostracism exists in every moment of our lives. What I loved about the second page here was she just wants to be known, so she goes to Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is, to look and see how many likes she's got. Why? Because it satisfies the same thing, right? To the point where people are addicting because they're affirming, and social media is addictive because it's confirming, because our identities are dependent on others. They emerge from interactions with others. And one of the surest ways to go insane is to be left alone, just to be alone and not have interactions with others. And though I don't necessarily have data, I have a theory that one of the reasons that it matters to being with others is because when we chat, when we look at each other, we resonate with body movements and words, we're actually stabilizing each other's brains, all right? And their carrier waves are taking out the bizarre high frequencies because they're being dampened by what's coming in from the other person. So I would argue that just being together is the therapy. The words get thrown on top and they're important, but this thing, the stabilizing aspect of being around other people is you refer to here as feel known. It's just incredibly, I'll use the word stabilizing to feel loved, right? There's a lot of anxiety that somewhat dissipates from the system. that's not there. And then you could do a whole story about stages of love, you know, the critical uncertainties before both say yes. And then something I want to talk about at some point in my life is the concept of old love. What it's, you know, what's the world like when you've been with someone for 30, 40 years and the world looks at that and doesn't see it as love, but it's one of the most satisfying things I suspect you could ever be in, with a level of comfort and calm. So I just love this idea of people just want to feel known. I think people have to feel known. And I think it's one of the surest ways to insanity, depression, is to not feel known, because you can't stabilize. So that's why I love that phrase, that image of pages. Anyone else want to comment on those pages? I'll put it back up. Did all of you imagine yourself picking up your phone and looking at Facebook when you read this page? I mean, we're all primed to do so. And my poor kids, you know, I railed for years that I wasn't ever going to do social media. And then I started about 6, 7 years ago, and I got just as addicted as a teenager. And it is truly addicting.
I would like to use this moment to point out the only reason I still have Facebook is because of Scott. So
You're so sweet.
no, not sweet, mister. You got to join Facebook and get on chat so that we can talk.
You should have let me have my moment there. Just sweet, okay? But you're right. I can't go back and forth between 4 social media platforms to organize people. I gotta,
No,
you know.
I get it. I do the same thing. I'm a lurker. I just watch all the videos and.
Well, you know, this thing about just feeling known, we know the data on social media, and particularly teenage girls, right? Because they're so unknown. This system renders them so completely alien in terms of what they're seeing and reading, that it just exacerbates adolescent identity tension.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I want to comment on in your observation, is that social media becomes this false friend for knowledge and understanding. I've written about social media in this piece for The Verge, where I was talking about what Instagram has done for my relationship to cartooning and my desire for connection, for sharing with a community, but how Instagram dangles that and then subverts it. And really, it's all just about advertising anyway.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think in the way that I am interacting with Instagram in that page, and the way that I have often interacted with Instagram as a creator, is that it is speaking to my desire for a certain kind of knowledge, which Jacob and I on that phone call in the previous page are discussing, which we talk about the Greek concept of kleos, which the Greek concept of kleos is to have your name on the public's lips, to have people talking about you, to have people liking your Instagram posts, to have people talk.
Yes.
This kind of knowledge that I, in writing a book like this, am clearly in conversation with, but also trying to get the other thing, which is, no, I want you to really know me. I want you to have intimacy with me. I want, you know, so those two kinds of knowledge are in conflict in a space like social media, because it calls you to the site because you think you're going to have connection.
Yep.
And then ultimately what you end up chasing is kleos. And I think kleos is arguably not the psychologically valuable kind of knowledge.
It's absolutely on target. I mean, it ends up being betrayal, right? And for younger people, it's one of the worst forms of betrayal. It's just like identity annihilation, and their identities are so fragile at that point. They're supposed to be trying different things, and we're
but it's so
preying on
dangerous.
them.
It's a wolf in sheep's clothing. I think that's the right metaphor. It's so giving you what you think you want. It's so seductive, and it can't. I think, you know, to be fair, social media can facilitate you finding the thing you really want. It can connect you to somebody, and then you can go meet them in a different platform and in person and have a great relationship. It's not to completely knock social media, but I think we have to really be aware of the ways that it's preying on our desire for connection and not really giving it to us.
I think everybody on the panel here is probably very capable of managing their relationship with social media, getting what they want out of it, getting it out of their life if they're not getting what they want out of it. I just consider kids that don't yet have that wisdom and are actually having their approach, their feeling of sociality being nurtured by, dare I just say, capitalist bots, right? To the point where breaking up is something you can do on the chat box. I mean, there's all these things that you can do that avoid the awkwardness of face-to-face conversation. And I would argue denying ourselves access to those awkward situations, it makes us increasingly sociopathic as a species, because we've not learned to deal with social difficulty, social complexities.
Not to
Anyone
like
else go ahead.
be like a social media enthusiast, because I am generally on the side of like not so great. But I mean, I guess I like, just to, play a little devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
I would argue that actually like kids these days are all right. They grew up in this environment. They are forging these really deep, intimate connections online through ways that like I think we just don't understand because we don't do it. And I mean, there's research to show that like teenagers these days have very deep, intimate social media accounts. They like feel like they are all of the versions of themselves online that they could be. And I mean, I think there's something like very neat and very exciting about like that sort of like, I mean, we're always going to have this technology, like, to be frank, like it's not going away. We can't legislate it away. And so I think watching them adapt to it in a way that like my generation was not able to, I think is quite nice. I mean, and so I think maybe this idea of like being known might change as we start moving into like a world in which like you are primarily known online. That is who you are. That is where your identity is constructed. And I mean, I'm particularly interested in this. This is partially what I work on. So this is something that's very interesting to me. But yeah, I mean, just to like point out that I do think it's bad, but I think in general, like the kids are probably okay.
No, I am totally on track with that. I suspect it comes down to some individual differences. Just some people more vulnerable than others. But
which is what I was going to say. I was going to say,
ahead.
as the victimologist on this panel, and Leandra also does some cyber victimization, I will also say the only thing that I ever worry about when we talk about the internet is victimization of children or predators online. That's all. I feel like I had to say it.
Yes, absolutely. Plus one to that. Yeah.
Man, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I just want to validate what Allison and Shelly and I have talked about this a lot too, where the kids are okay. I think the kids know. I love your point about having like being able to, you just talked about having multiple points of our own selves throughout multiple time. Like, I think it will be interesting to see how that goes with this generation, given so much is going to be readily available for a database, is going to be so multiple views of them in one spot. And I know, at least in our research, if people are using it in that way to find information and share parts about their identity, it's actually really helpful. They're super healthy. I mean, it's one of the biggest tools we have to help LGBT youth feel like they can find someone to connect to and feel inclusion and be known. It's when we do that weird thing that my generation does, where we use it to stalk people and to find romance and monitor. When we start monitoring other people to compare to ourselves, that's when we fall in the trap. But I would say those people are probably the same people who did that before there was technology. So
yes,
I think it exacerbates that. But I was waiting, Shelly. I was like, Shelly's going to come in and be like, here's what I'm worried about.
Yeah. You can always count on me.
No, I agree. That is the one thing to worry about. That and, government oversight into our social media. But
I want to add one more worry, which is, I guess the point that I love so much is that especially young people find ways to cope with whatever is happening, that no technology, no tool of oppression can ever really squash human creativity and human desire for connection. I really do believe that. And so I think our discomfort with social media is there has to be something that we don't know about how young people people have learned how to cope with it because they've grown up with it. So I think that's a really important point. The thing, though, that I feel that social media amplifies are some of the frustrating aspects of marketplaces. I'm not anti-marketplace, but I do think that marketplaces have certain, especially marketplaces without certain kinds of regulation, like the attention economy of social media has had certain kinds of a kind of been like a loudspeaker for certain negative base elements of humanity. And I think that, I think that speaks to the fear about victims. And I think it also just speaks to the sort of way that our attention might be changing. And some things are lost when our attentional qualities change and erode. And so, but that's not inherent to social media. That's inherent to the forces that have seized on social media and made them basically one big advertisement.
So I'm not going to say how long ago, but I worked with a guy in Germany for a while. And when I got back to the States, there was no internet yet. So he would share drafts of papers through fax machines. And so I get a 40-page fax. I got chewed out for it being too expensive. But as I got those facts from him, I had a different kind of relationship than I'd had in my life before. And there was a sense of being together in those ideas. And then when the internet came around and I could write to anybody, the point Allison's making, the point you're all making about adapting and having different types of selves, the internet saved my career in the sense that being the kind of scholar that I am, I could write to anybody in the world at any time and find a kindred spirit. And that I was able to actually do things I would not have been able to do if I didn't have that connection available. So yeah, absolutely. And it does transform your presence and your sense of identity for sure. I have 8:24 here. We got any questions from the audience there? Well, they're not coming with questions, so I'm going to ask the rest of the panel if they have any questions they might like to ask Amy before we're finished.
I do. Amy, are you working on something new? Can you share anything about what you're working on?
Oh, man. This book was so hard. I don't know if that's clear from the density of some of the pages, and people listening don't know that it's like almost a 400-page book. So this book really, really took it out of me. And my next project, so I can talk theoretically about what I'd like. I have many ideas, but I can talk theoretically about the next project that I think I'm gonna work on, that I've started writing and kind of drafting, which is that I came to the conclusion, thinking so much about AI and thinking about the future, thinking about what kinds of roles are going to be not able to be automated, what kinds of human values we're going to increasingly notice are the most important. And I came to the conclusion that care is the most, and care work is going to be one of the most important things. And so I got this idea that I want to write a book of interconnected short stories that all focus on different kinds of caretakers and broadly defining what a caretaker is. There's the obvious, like nurse, teacher, etc., but thinking about what are other kinds of care, how does care show up in different ways, and then also thinking philosophically about the idea of caring. And I've been thinking a lot, especially related to social media, this idea of how much we're asked to care about all the time and whether or not that's really possible. This is so relevant lately with just the bombardment of horrible images from wars around the world. And what is that state that puts us in, with this trying to care about things that we can't actually interact with in our sort of in our bodies? We can't like go care for somebody who is across the world. What does that do to us? And then how does that show up in the way that we perform care? So these are all ideas that are swirling in my head. And the way that I tend to work on big projects, which this will probably take me 6 years. So that's my guess how long it'll be that I'll be working on this particular project. But I start with lots of writing, stories, essays, scripts. And I'm thinking that I want to work in fiction, which is not entirely new for me, but it is new for this form. So that's another challenge. How am I going to get across some of the complexity and intimacy of my earlier books into something that's fictional? And maybe I can't do it. I'm like, maybe this is not going to happen. So thinking about holding all of that in my head as I just write different characters and ideas and scenes and stories. So that's where I'm at with that next project.
Someone needs to do a documentary about how much creative work ends up on the floor. You know, I mean, because you do all this stuff. And, you know, when you're writing a paper in Word, you just get rid of that paragraph and write over it. You know, but if you're in editing, well, these days editing is digital. But back in the day, editing analog film would just be on the floor, right? There's just tons of stuff that just never shows up in the work. Yet we know that destroying that created the possibility of what came next. So that's one of my favorite things about the creative process.
Yeah, a fun story about that next book. I went to an artist residency to start working on it, and I got the flu, and I spent the whole residency week sick with no one to take care of me because nobody wanted to get sick. So that was an interesting experience of me starting to write this book about care. That was the first step.
Well, you know, someday you could also write Artificial 2.0. Right. And you could talk about the culture's reaction to the artificial story about the artificial, but you know what I'm saying? It just never stops.
Right.
And that's the thing about communication. It's pretty boundless. All right. Anyone, final comment? Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Just one question, and I'm very, it's out of curiosity, Amy. Did you have, this Eastern concept of reincarnation in mind, when you wrote this text? Because, I'm located in a tradition where, rebirth and, births connected with one another and eternity of soul, these are, mainstream conversations and where the texts, affirm, these concepts. So did you have this, Eastern concept in mind when you were writing this text?
I'm sure it was in the mix. I mean, there's so many of these kinds of big ideas that get passed into cultures, and there's just sort of different language and different stories around them. I mean, the biggest Western idea that I was thinking about was the concept of resurrection, but I would always put that word in quotes. Like, what does it mean that this person is being brought back to life? And then I would sort of ground that in the idea of memory and in the Coco ideas that we've been talking about, that somebody might pass on, but their memory is still alive. And so I guess I'm not educated enough in the specifics of Eastern philosophy and the idea of resurrection, but what it makes me think about is that there's a kind of life force that we're all connected to, and that when you die, you pass back into it. And then what do we do with that life force? It's still there for us. So those of us who are living can sort of reach into that life force and bring something else out of it. And I don't know if that resonates with the concept of resurrection in the Eastern tradition, but for me, it's sort of like a Star Wars force thing. I think I would say, to the extent that Eastern philosophy influenced Star Wars, I was influenced by Star Wars, and then I've been influenced by Eastern philosophy. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I have read about Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and things like that, but not in a scholarly way. So.
Well, it's a little after 8:30, and unfortunately, it's time to bring this amazing conversation to a close. Amy, it was an absolute blast to discuss your creative work with you this evening. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to next time.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions and your choices of pages. It's been a pleasure.
It was an absolutely thrilling conversation. Leandra, Shelly, Allison, and Gurpyari, thank you so much for joining us at ReggieCon and helping us celebrate Women's History Month. Then I have notes that say, let them say goodbye. So that means us. So this is, I got more announcements. I got a bad habit of just saying bye and not letting people say goodbye. And that's just not That's just not nice. Anyway, I do want to share a couple of announcements. First of all, we've got ReggieCon in April, Arab American Heritage Month. If you tuned into Arab American Heritage Month, last year's ReggieCon, we had the same duo there last time, Habibti Pada. We discussed the first book that they wrote. Now we'll be discussing Habibti Pada Shawazmeek with author Amin Boudin and illustrator Ishmael Hernandez. And then we'll have 3 ISU graduate students joining us for the conversation. Faria Osman, Maisha Tazin Orthi, and Edsal Javier Cinturon Gonzalez. Also, please don't forget, take a screenshot if you can. Get that QR code. It'll take you to the ReggieCon Live 2024 page. It's going to be an absolute blast. We hope you can all be there. Everything is free. I want to quickly, once again, thanks to everyone behind the scenes for making us look like we know what we're doing. I want to thank everyone for joining our ReggieCon celebration of Women's History Month. Until next time, have a good evening.